All right, today I will be talking about NP by Banana Yoshimoto. Again, another Banana Yoshimoto. Translated by Sherif. So, new translator this time. Um, why did I choose this book? Quite simply, when I went to put Kitchen back, I was looking through my other Banana Yoshimoto books and I saw this one. And to be dead ass honest, I remembered nothing about this book. So I pulled it out, and the first thing it says on the back is NP is the title of the last collection of short stories by a celebrated Japanese writer, which immediately made me think, oh, this is a short story collection by Banana Yoshimoto. But no, it goes on to say written in English while he was living in Boston. So I was like, wait, what? I don't remember anything about this. I don't remember anything about this book. So I decided, it's short, it's not even 200 pages, to pull it out and give it another read through. And the one thing that I do remember about this book, that I knew it was in a Banana Yoshimoto book, but I couldn't remember which one. Very memorable scene towards the end. So I'll kind of get into that with themes. But brief synopsis. The main character is a 20-something-year-old woman who, when she was a teenager, dated a translator who was an adult, much older than she was. And the translator was translating a work by this famous Japanese author. He lived in America, so it was written in English. And she meets his children, his son and daughter, at a party. And supposedly the story that he wrote, his last story, is cursed because after he wrote this 98th story, he committed suicide, and then the original translator of his work, also committed suicide after trying to translate it, and her boyfriend committed suicide after translating it. So it seems like this very cursed work, and it sort of follows this sort of outsider protagonist as she interacts with his two children and his daughter. So his two children and rather his daughter by another mother. So that's the basic setup. And so we'll get straight into a recommendation. And kind of, yes, I mean, why not? It's not the most amazing book in the world, but I find it very captivating. And again, it in kind of a similar way to Kitchen, very much wears its heart on its sleeve and can be a bit sentimental. And I can see how that would turn off a lot of readers. But at the same time, I think that if you're into that kind of thing, like, it's a very easy read and very pleasant to read almost, despite all the depression and whatnot. Like, I kind of struggle with giving recommendations because it's difficult to think of a book that you wouldn't recommend. I have come across them, at least in some capacity, to some people, and I'd rather give books chances than just yes or no. So yeah, I mean, I very much enjoyed reading through it. Again, even if it's not necessarily the deepest thing that I've ever read, it was still a pleasant time. So if that sounds good to you, or if anything I've mentioned before sounds good to you, then by all means, give it a read. So going into the pros and cons, similar to Kitchen, but I think this time even a bit better, is the very easy to read prose. In some ways, Banana Yoshimoto's prose captures the sort of dreamlike ethereal essence of Japanese fiction that I enjoy so much in, like, Murakami, which I guess is one of the reasons that they get recommended together so often. But also, basically everything that was good about Kitchen, I think you can say is good about NP, with the added benefit that the book is a little bit longer, so the characters definitely feel more fleshed out, or at least you get more time to spend with them than you do in Kitchen. And it also has the added effect for me of making the situations feel a bit less sort of heightened reality or melodramatic. But, in terms of negatives, cons, again, similar to Kitchen, I can see, it is sort of relies a bit on emotion and that emotional aspect to things. It's a book much more about pathos than most other things. And I can see how that it almost lends it kind of a YA quality. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but more in the sense that, again, very reliant on pathos, very reliant on emotion, and not super deep in terms of what it's trying to say or what it's trying to capture. I once described YA, and this is kind of how I think of YA, as YA introduces people to concepts, whereas adult fiction tends to operate under the assumption that you already appreciate the concept and are looking to get into it a little bit deeper. So in that sense, MP is very good at introducing concepts of depression and what it's like to be around depressed people and how that can sort of provide a cloud over things, and alternatives to depression and social stigma and things like that. Like, all that's in here, but it's not super deep, which, again, like, it's a con for me, but it's not something that I really want to hold against the book, because the book isn't necessarily trying to explore that, and I don't think that every book needs to be, this ultra deep dive into stuff. So that's my personal con, but don't let it stop you from picking up the book if the book sounds interesting. So, getting into the themes. So, one last thing before getting into full spoilers is another reason that I'm really reminded of YA is at the end of the book, there's an afterword, and I've seen this sometimes in translated light novels that's written by the author where they talk about, very, very briefly, it's only not even 2 full pages, about what they were thinking when they wrote the book or whatever. So in that sense, thematically, again, like Kitchen, very much wears its heart on its sleeve, very easy to follow and understand. And the author just straight up says, these are the things that I really wanted to address in this book. So not even in that sense a difficult, it's not going to be straining your reading abilities, your critical reading abilities, which is fine. Again, like, I don't want to sound like I'm super down on it for that. It's just something to be aware of regarding the book. So, again, from here on out, spoilers straight up. So getting into it, thematically, again, death is a huge thing. I think of a lot of Banana Yoshimoto's work thematically deals with death or grieving in some sense. It kind of makes you wonder what her personal life has been like. But in the back of the book, she says, I've attempted in this miniature universe to touch on as many of the themes that interest me as possible: lesbianism, love within the family, telepathy and empathy, the occult, religion, and so on. And the one thing that she doesn't mention is the thing that I personally really took away as being central to the book. So I'm going to talk about really quickly each one of the things that she lists and whether, how much I saw in the book, and then kind of get into my personal takeaway and theme. And that's not to say that one is more important than the other, just that I find it interesting. But we'll get into that more later. So, lesbianism. There is... So, what I didn't mention in the earlier section, because it kind of gets into the story a little bit, is Sui, who's the daughter, the sort of... you have the 2 twins who are, let's call them the legitimate children. Sui is the kind of illegitimate child of this Japanese author. And at one point, she had a relationship, sexual as well, with the father. They didn't know at the time, and then they found out. And then throughout the story, she's in a relationship, sexual as well, with her stepbrother. So she is described as this very magnetic person, and by turns really depressing, and almost oppressive in the way that she's very strong-willed, but then also happy, vibrant, the kind of person who, being around her, the protagonist describes it as the kind of person that you could fall in love with and become dependent on. And while I can't say that I relate to that, I find the lesbianism aspect a bit difficult to agree with, insofar as, yes, she does mention that she could fall in love with her, and at times she thinks about kissing her, but it's difficult for me to parse out. Like, to me, that's just really good friends, somebody that you really like, and it doesn't come across to me like a romantic attraction so much as it does just a really solid friendship, and more a byproduct of Sui's circumstances and the way it sort of gives her this magnetic property that can really draw people into her, even though she is very isolated and has no friends. So it's not like overt lesbianism. It doesn't really feel like a big theme to the story so much as just an aspect of Sui's personality that the protagonist, given that the protagonist is, slightly related insofar as her boyfriend killed himself translating this work, doesn't have that same connection to the situation that Sui and Otohiko and Saki have. So, by that, she is an outsider ultimately, and that makes her in a way more susceptible to this magnetism of Sui's. And love within the family, I already mentioned. It's not... The interesting thing is that the book, the reason that Sui and Otohiko's relationship doesn't work isn't because they're brother-sister. And the story kind of goes on to talk about how it never really outright approves of their relationship, but the definite text and subtext is that most people should just leave them alone, that they have something between themselves, and that while it's not ideal, and it's not the reason that the relationship isn't going to work or whatever. And, if two people work well together, then don't stress so much those details. So, it's there, but I don't how do I say this? It's an element of the story, but it's difficult to see it as the book having a hardcore thesis on it, because again, that element is secondary to why their relationship falls apart. And lest I come across as calling that, being critical about that, one of the things that I like about fiction that I think a lot of people struggle with nowadays is that they want, kind of protagonists to be likable, and if the protagonist does something bad or the book deals with a theme that makes people uncomfortable, they really just shut down the book and shut it down. And I think one of the powerful things about fiction is its ability to show these situations that make us uncomfortable and show the nuance behind them, to where, if you first heard the situation, you'd go, no, that's wrong. But then you get shown the nuance of it, and you start to realize that life isn't that easy or that simple when you start adding in nuance. So, I appreciate, stepbrother and stepsister dating is definitely on the surface a very bad thing, but the more you get into the nuance, the more you can still disagree with their choice, but you can at least start to see and appreciate why they made it, I hope. So in that sense, I think that it's good. Or, it's good that it's present in the book. So telepathy and empathy, the occult, religion, not so much. But telepathy, I have no idea. I just finished the book and I don't recall any kind of telepathy. But in terms of empathy, yes. And this will be kind of switching over into my own sort of big takeaway from the book. And that's the cycle of depression, which I guess to cover the empathy and occult thing, to Sui, there is a curse. It killed her father, it killed the first translator, it killed... Oh yeah, I should mention that the translator that the protagonist is dating Sui was once dating him. But it's depression and the sort of way that depression can seem like a self-fulfilling prophecy and how difficult it is to break out of it, and also the magnetism. So we've kind of got quite a bit going on, but this is the part that really speaks to me, because I've been in these situations a lot where, as an outsider with a relatively stable life, I've got my problems, but compared to some of the other stuff that I've seen in friends, my life is pretty stable. But it's easy when people are in these sort of depressed or really dramatic, highly tense situations, they kind of look for outsiders who, and I'm not saying this critically, but they're looking for people who are distant enough from the situation that they can provide the outside perspective, but close enough to the situation that they understand and relate to it, and can understand where the various parties are coming from. And as somebody with a fairly stable life, both myself and the protagonist of the story find themselves drawn into these people. I mentioned Sui's magnetism, and she is definitely the most tragic of all of them. I mean, her mother beat her as a child. Her mother was a prostitute, so often wasn't there. She herself has slept around with men for money and financial reasons. She, again, ends up sleeping with a man who turns out to be her father. That person commits suicide. She ends up in a relationship with her stepbrother, and as much as they clearly like each other and enjoy, have a thing for each other, they're horribly toxic for each other because they're both so touched by this tragedy. And certain people like that, there is a magnetism to them, and I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the fact that the way that their life has been changes the way that they approach and interact with the world, but they have a pull that I have in the past found very difficult to escape, and you can end up as a part of that story, not as a primary player, but certainly as a tertiary figure, on the outside. And it can affect your life too if you're not very careful with how you handle it. And certainly in the story, the protagonist is described as somebody who helps everybody sort of move on and break this self-fulfilling cycle, because Sui and Otohiko are both described as people who are on the path to death and on the path to suicide. And it's through this sort of outside source, somebody who isn't caught up in this cycle. Because I can also say, having been depressed myself, that your world shrinks down. And it can feel, many times the protagonist talks about the summer feeling like a dreamlike state, like she's entered another world. And certainly when you're depressed, the world shrinks down to just your sort of immediate interactions. And that's how I feel, my interpretation reading it is of this protagonist being drawn into this insular world of depression through these people who are very magnetic in that way that depressed or, highly dramatic people undergoing highly dramatic situations can be, and how she gets involved with it and she can feel it, and she definitely reflects on situations in her own life, but how ultimately it is through her kind of normalcy and reaction to it, reacting through understanding and whatnot, but also by just giving these characters who are so stuck in their own world an out and a reminder of the outside and of what things exist beyond their square, becomes kind of the catalyst for most of them, not necessarily instantly recovering, but shifting towards a track of recovery and a more positive existence. Just sometimes by being there, by having these conversations, and by accepting people for who they are, rather than, like I said, not getting super judgmental about their relationship. She's able to say, like, you shouldn't have been dating because of your relationship, but she never, judges them harshly for it or whatever. She just kind of accepts people for what they are. But I appreciate that she's also at times stands up for herself and she's not a total pushover. So that's, positive as well, because there was definitely the risk of writing her as this sort of passive character that just gets sucked into everything and goes along with everything. And maybe that's why it was so important to write this from her perspective and not the perspective of, like, Sui, who is definitely, if you read the afterword from the author, and if you kind of read the book, you might get the impression, is definitely the character that Banana Yoshimoto is the most interested in, and I feel like most people would probably make the protagonist of the story. But I think by not getting Sui's perspective or her thoughts, it gives her the air of mystery that helps authenticate the magnetism that the protagonist feels towards her. But it also, like I said, allows the protagonist to come across as somebody with a will of their own, and not just a sort of go along with everything yes man that solves everything by being basically a teddy bear that other people can talk to. Again, it's difficult to say, having read the final afterward from the author, she doesn't mention depression anywhere in things that she was trying to embody, but it's certainly my experience with the book, and me bringing my own experience from the outside to the book, that I do see it as hugely about depression and those topics, to the point where the scene that I described that I always remember is Sui calls her to her house and ends up drugging her, the protagonist, and is going to commit, doesn't really know what to do, to be honest. Like, she was going to, she was thinking about maybe killing her and then killing herself so that she doesn't die alone, or of just knocking her out and then killing herself. But the reason that the scene stuck with me so much is that Sui actually says jokingly that the food is poisoned, and then the food is poisoned and it knocks her out, and then nothing ends up happening. It sort of calls to mind the ending of South of the Border, West of the Sun by Murakami, where again you have a situation of somebody is invited to a distant place and very much could have been a victim of a double suicide, but in the end the other person decided against it. So that it's just difficult for me not to see depression as a major aspect of the book, and maybe that compromises my interpretation. I'm sure I sound very different talking about the book, because it does kind of bring up a lot of memories for me that aren't the easiest thing in the world to deal with, but those are more my memories, and sometimes that's kind of the effectiveness of a simpler narrative like this, where again it's almost YA in the way that it is so focused on the emotions, the pathos, without really getting into the logos or side of things. So I don't really know where I'm going with this at this point. Interesting book. I can see why some people might not like it. It's certainly not a favorite book of mine, but I definitely enjoyed reading it and reflected a decent amount on it. At the very least, it made me look back on my own life, though I'm not really sure if it really made me reflect on those moments and pull something new out of them, or if it just made me reflect on those remind me of those moments. And that's one of the huge differences, I think, with fiction is, evoking a personal memory is something special on its own, but the best fiction can really get in there and make you reflect on it and take away something new from it. And I certainly did a lot of remembering, but I don't know how much reflecting I did. But that might just be me. So next time I will definitely be reviewing Breasts and Eggs, Miyoko Kawakami's, because one of the things that you see in MP is the main character, and the absence of fathers is another thing that kind of happens throughout the book. That might also be a theme that I should have brought up and forgot. But the way MP handles it is to say that they ended up okay, but they definitely missed having a father. And at the end of the book, Sui ultimately, being pregnant, wants to find somebody who can be a father for her child. And that stands in such stark contrast to the Breasts and Eggs stance of fuck fathers, you don't need fathers, you'll be fine, single mothers power through, that I remember that book being about to an almost annoying degree. So I definitely have to go back and reread Breasts and Eggs to see, how hard it goes into that. So that'll be next time. And until then, take care.